Mr. President,
Professor Sunderland.
I am honored to present to you Patrick J. Fitzgerald as a candidate for the degree Doctor of Laws. Patrick Fitzgerald has become a national icon. When he came to Chicago in 2001, he was known in legal circles as the nation's preeminent terror prosecutor. Mr. Fitzgerald was designated the National Law Journal's Lawyer of the Year and has received awards from the Attorney General of the United States and the New York City Bar Association. His office battles organized crime, prosecutes public corruption, and fights terrorism and violent crime. He leads efforts to dismantle the pillars of crime, efforts on which his office's reputation was built. He has been referred to as Eliot Ness with a Harvard degree and a sense of humor. Mr. Fitzgerald, a native of Brooklyn, New York, graduated from Amherst College, Phi Beta Kappa, and from Harvard Law School. After 3 years in private practice, he joined the United States Attorney's Office in Manhattan and has served as chief of the Organized Crime Terrorism Unit, and there began his zealous pursuit of justice. He was involved in the prosecution of defendants charged with conspiracy to murder United States nationals overseas and the August 1998 bombings of United States embassies. He participated in the trial of defendants charged in a conspiracy that involved the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center and a plot to bomb the United Nations, the FBI building in New York, and the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, as well as a conspiracy to assassinate President Mubarak of Egypt. He supervised the 1996 prosecution of three defendants who conspired in the Philippines to detonate bombs simultaneously on 12 American airliners. He participated in the trial that convicted members of the Gambino crime family for various offenses, including murder and jury tampering. He also served on the United States Attorney General's Advisory Committee and has chaired its subcommittee on terrorism. Mr. Fitzgerald is devoted to truth. He was appointed special counsel to investigate the Valerie Plame affair, which involved Vice President Cheney's Chief of Staff, Louis Scooter Libby. In the context of this case, critics suggested that an indictment should not be based on a perjury technicality. Mr. Fitzgerald responded, "The truth is the engine of our judicial system. If you compromise the truth, the whole process is lost." Mr. Fitzgerald's other high-profile cases include the prosecution of Illinois Governor George Ryan and the prosecution of several aides to Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, who were involved in the hired truck program. He is currently prosecuting Governor Rod Blagojevich for involvement in an alleged conspiracy to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat to the highest bidder. Mr. Fitzgerald takes seriously the task of remolding Illinois' culture of corruption. He responds to criticisms of his prosecution of political figures. One day I read I was a Republican hack. One day I read I was a Democratic hack. The only thing I did between those two nights was sleep. Richard Phelan, Chicago lawyer and former Knox trustee, observed that if Mr. Fitzgerald were not a prosecutor, he'd be a priest. He's totally and completely dedicated. Mr. Fitzgerald recognizes that law is not merely the art of the possible, but the art of the best possible. Mr. President, in recognition of his extraordinary achievements and his steadfast devotion to truth, justice, and law, it's a privilege to present Patrick J. Fitzgerald for the degree Doctor of Laws.
Mr. Fitzgerald, by authority delegated to me, I hereby confer upon you the honorary degree of Doctorate of Laws, with all the privileges and dignities which here and elsewhere pertain. Congratulations.
President Taylor, trustees, distinguished faculty, and most important, the students graduating here today, timing's everything, and your family and friends. I'm truly honored and humbled to be able to speak to you here today and to receive a degree I didn't earn, but I will treasure from such a great institution with a storied history. What I'd like to do is to think back to where I was when I graduated way back in 1982 and think about how the world has changed and how my view of the world has changed. And I wanted to share with you two thoughts that took a long time to get into my head, so maybe I can get them into yours a little quicker. And the first thought that I'd like to bring home to you is that sometimes people think of public service as sacrifice, and you should never think of it that way, because it may cause you not to engage in public service and thereby cheat yourself. And let me explain what I mean. Way back when I was graduating from college, if someone talked to me about public service, I thought it was a really great thing. But what I would mean by that was a really great thing for somebody else to do. So when I heard about people joining the Peace Corps and going off to war-torn places or places with disease and poverty and making a difference, I thought that was great. If someone was willing to sign up and put on a uniform and put their life on the line to defend our country, I thought that was great. And if someone wanted to go to an inner city and teach in a school to make lives better for people, I thought that was great. I just had other plans for myself. And part of it was a pretty simplistic view of the world. There was a professor who talked about the difference between doing good and doing well. And so I had this simplistic notion that you had one door to choose from out of the two. Those people who went through the door that said doing good did great things. And other people who went through the door that said do well had a very profitable life. And it was understandable that I would think that way. And some of you might want to think that way because my parents were immigrants. I know a lot of you are first generations to go to college as I was. My parents grew up on a farm, left Ireland, and came here for a better life. And when you finally graduate from college, I should have worn the hat. When you finally graduate from college, you think, I should take that opportunity. And what I learned over the course of time is that was a mistaken way of looking at things. I'll shorten my remarks, too. One of the things I did as an intern was I worked at the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office and saw some great work by people. They were working on motorcycle gangs, people running guns for the IRA. I actually ran into a mafioso walking into court trying to bring some research to a prosecutor who didn't know who I had nearly knocked over. And I thought, this is a great job. And I thought to myself, if I came back in a different life with an inheritance or hit the lottery, then I'd go do that great job. Well, why would I do something that didn't pay the most that I could possibly earn? And after a few years of private practice, I decided to join a U.S. Attorney's Office in New York. And from that moment forward, I've been a prosecutor for 21 years, and not one day has been sacrificed. One of the things I got to work on was to have experience working on a case involving the mafia. And it was hard work, but we spent 6 months in the courtroom with people who were members of the Gambino crime family who were engaged in a plot to ship hundreds and hundreds of pounds of heroin from Sicily to the U.S. and hundreds of pounds of cocaine from South America to the U.S. And they were involved in killing people, bribing jurors, breaking people out of jail. It was something out of a movie. But that was hard work, but it wasn't sacrifice. I got an insight to sort of see how people thought and appreciated how the criminal mind began to work. and realized that people, even in a group as violent as La Cosa Nostra, which is what they called themselves, had a sort of code of how they behaved. This rigid set of rules that they thought made sense. And in fact, when they took an oath, they called themselves men of honor. And from what little I've read about your honor code, I think their honor code was very different. Certainly they have different sanctions. But it was something that made me start thinking about why people do the things they do, for good or for evil. And later on, I began to work on a case with a team that we spent 9 months in a courtroom with people who basically wanted to blow up New York City. They were involved with the World Trade Center bombers in 1993, and they wanted to blow up bridges and tunnels. And after that experience, I began to work on a case with other people involving Osama bin Laden back before we didn't really know who he was, back before he made himself famous by doing horrible things. And in the summer of 1998, when 2 embassies were bombed, I had the privilege to go overseas with a team of people and watch how people responded, and watch how ordinary civilians and others were climbing through rubble to save lives. And as a result of that experience, I began to think more and more about how people think. And I used to think when I was in college, when you studied philosophy or political science, I would think, this is really interesting to think about how people think. But at the end of the day, how much difference does that make in the real world? Thinking about thinking doesn't seem all that relevant. And then I began to realize that how people think and what their ideology is and how they view the world can be a very, very powerful force for good or for evil. And one of the things that we saw after bombings, we would see a remarkable sort of dual investigation. You would see a forensic, a physical investigation where people would dig through craters. They'd look for the smallest pieces of metal that had markings on them that would show that they were very close to the bomb blast. And they would know that this was part of the vehicle that contained the bomb. They'd work tirelessly to find more pieces and put it together and figure out which car part it was. And from that, they would work back and figure out what type of car it was. And they'd work harder and they'd figure out the exact car, the specific car that was used to carry the bomb. And then they could figure out where the car was parked, which direction it was faced, what the bomb was made of, and how it was set off. And you'd see these remarkable science showing where the ignition went to the chaos. And at the same time, we do forensics of the mind. You would go through the thoughts of the people who carried out this evil deed and realize what it was that set them off, what it was that set off in someone's mind to convince them that this was a good thing to do, and how it evolved. And I had the privilege to work with a great team, and we had the opportunity to sit down with people who sat in a room with Osama bin Laden and watched how his mindset evolved from a hatred of the Soviet Union to a hatred of the West and the U.S., and how rhetoric went to violence, and violence against military went to violence against civilians. And those experiences, all those things were horrible things I wish never happened. But if I had thought public service was sacrifice and didn't have a chance to involve myself in part of that response and see what it was all about and learn from it, I would have cheated myself more than anyone else. When I moved to Chicago, my experience was very different. I was in the courtroom a lot less and responsible for working with lots of hardworking people that you never hear about. And they work on cases that you hear less about than you should. And I'll give you one example. An awful lot of people work very, very hard to combat the problem of drugs, gangs, and violence in our inner cities. And you hear about it, but you don't hear about it enough because it's a real problem. We hear about it in Chicago when, in the last year, a number of school-aged children are killed. Or like today, when a Chicago police officer is being buried as we speak, giving his life, fighting for a community. And it makes you think that there's an awful lot of people doing an awful lot of work, and what a privilege it is to work with them and see what they do. So for any of you out there, I know I'm preaching to the choir, to an awful lot of you, who want to go out and do something very, very important and help others. If any of you are sort of thinking the way I was, that public service just means sacrifice, it's never a sacrifice. It's a luxury to be able to do what it is that you'd like to do. Let me just briefly turn to the second point. And the second point is that sometimes I think we give public servants, and particularly law enforcement, too much credit. And there's a danger in that. And the reason that there's a danger in that is that we take away some of the responsibility society has to deal with larger problems. If you give someone else credit, you give them responsibility. And in a subtle way, society can walk away from some of the things we need to address. And it will make that concrete. In the areas of violence and drugs and gangs, We can put it in the box and say it's a law enforcement problem. We can look at corporate corruption and say that's a law enforcement problem. And we can look at public corruption and say it's a law enforcement problem. And that means we don't have to deal with it. It's covered. It's dealt with. And if we need to hire more law enforcement, then do that. And that's a mistake because it doesn't work that way. The reason we have violence is we often have large areas of our cities in different parts of the country where we have lack of educational opportunities. We don't have good role models. We have more gang structures at times than family structures. And what we have to do is address the problems of poverty. You may think it odd that a prosecutor is talking about the reasons why people commit crime. I don't think growing up in a poor neighborhood excuses you from crime. You can't rob a bank, shoot someone, and excuse it by having a rough upbringing. Many people have rough upbringings and make very positive contributions. But I think we make a big mistake if we don't recognize that while we hold individuals responsible for what they do, we have a much larger responsibility to address the underlying problems that cause violence to grow. And carrying that over to public corruption or corporate corruption, I think we have a willingness to hold people accountable when we see people who are crooks and steal money from companies or cause losses to shareholders, and then we jump to law enforcement as the next solution. And we skip past the middle. In the middle are the people who are out there working, who are honest, who see up front that other people are corrupt and don't do anything about it sometimes. And they're good people, but I think they rationalize that someone should say, you know, that person shouldn't be corrupt. And they ought to worry about the FBI finding out about what they're doing. They don't think to themselves, they ought to worry about my telling the FBI about what they're doing. I'm not a big person on philosophers, but an FBI agent I work with in Africa gave me a picture when I left New York of the scenes of the bombings, and it had an inscription at the bottom from Edmund Burke that said, all that evil needs to flourish is for good men to do nothing. And that's a very powerful insight and lesson that we can't take the view that if law enforcement's out there, let them take care of it. People need to stand up and be counted when they see wrongdoing around them. And that's doubly true in the public corruption arena. I'm very concerned that people think that we will end public corruption at the end of handcuffs or subpoenas. What we really need is a cultural change, not from law enforcement, but from the people joining society, the citizens full adult citizens you're about to become. There may be a day in the future where some of you are approached by someone when you want something from the government. They may ask you to pay them something. They may ask you to pay them something even though you're entitled to what you're supposed to get, but you'll be afraid about what happens if you don't. And we need to change that world. We need not to have people think when they come up to you and someone else gives you advice and says, well, don't worry, that's the way it is, that's the way it works, just go along, no one will know. We need people to understand that if we take the attitude that that's the way it is, that's only true and each and every one of you allows it to be. We need to take the world and change it in a way that people who ask people for money when they hold public office need not be able to understand that the people they ask are afraid not to say yes. We need to make the people who would ask afraid to ask in the first place. I know that you here at Knox College lived by an honor code for the last 4 years. That should not be a phase you went through as you go onto the big campus of the real world. You should view that as an apprenticeship, a 4-year apprenticeship from being concerned students to being active citizens. And if you each here resolved here today that every one of you would resolve that if anyone ever tried to corrupt business, society, or government in your presence, that you would scream loudly, that you would blow the whistle, that you would be as loud as one of those train horns, that would make a real difference in the world. It's not lost on me that the people here today are graduating because you have ability, talent, energy, and drive. What you do with your life is up to you from here on out. I suggest to you that if you have the chance to do public service, if you find a way that's meaningful to you where you think you can contribute, you should grab it, whether that's full-time, whether that's part-time. But you can make a difference in this world if you send the word out that you will be active citizens who will stand up and be counted when others do wrong. Good luck.